been asked to ask if the participants agree to being recorded. If you're fine with that, just say yes. If you're not, say no. Is everyone cool with that? Yeah. Okay. So yes, they consent to being recorded. So just on a matter of housekeeping, we're going to do what we've been doing the whole tournament. Billet 1, billet 6, billet 7, 7:15. We can play continuous banging. Would appreciate if when we got to that second, 7:15, you stop. Pure eyes, hard 15 seconds. You pass that, and we're going to have to, bang you out. We wouldn't want to bang you out. Be respectful, understanding that it's a full contact sport. Please don't be disrespectful to your other teammates. But in general, also, can you hear this? Is that fine with everyone? Okay, that's the bill that we're going to be using. Okay, so to open up, we have Prime Minister from Opening Government to open up the debate here.
Yeah.
Yes, you can.
Cool. Hi everyone, my name is Greg. I use he/they pronouns. Nice to meet you all. Okay, I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. In society, we recognize that violence goes beyond just brute force, which is why when derogatory terms are used against minorities, we call it an act of violence. We think, similarly, financial crimes, white-collar crimes, are an act of violence against the most destitute and desperate individuals of our society, and it is an abysmal failure that the criminal justice system currently does not properly compensate for this harm. What are we going to tell you in OG? 2 things in this speech. Firstly, why it is the case that white-collar crimes are particularly egregious and have malicious intent that ought to be adequately punishable in the justice system. Second, I'm going to show you why the criminal justice system acting in this manner is consistent with the principles of justice. Let's do some case setup. What exactly are white-collar crimes and who is likely to commit them? We are talking about things like tax evasion. Remember, this is different from tax avoidance. So the same way you can avoid certain kinds of tax legally, for example, you can avoid VAT by not buying as much. Tax evasion is you actively breaking the law and going beyond what is required of you. This is also like things such as tax fraud or things like embezzlement of corporations or tender fraud where you are misusing and misappropriating funds for your own individual benefit. The key thing here is that for you to be able to perpetuate these crimes, you have to be in a relatively privileged position, i.e. you have to be an executive at a multi-million-dollar company, or you have to be a government official, or you just need to be someone who is rich enough and is not paying their fair share in terms of taxation. That is important context for layer. Secondly, within the purpose of the criminal justice system is to mitigate harms in society, and in instances where it can't mitigate the harm, to properly compensate for the harm that has been done. Specifically with jail time, this looks towards retribution, sometimes rehabilitation, but we think mostly to do justice onto the victims such that they can feel that their harm has been heard and it has been done. In the status quo, the criminal justice system is far too lenient on these individuals. For example, they can make you pay a fine, or they can make you pay back the taxes, and I'll show you later on in my argumentation, but this is insufficient in terms of compensating for the harm that has been done. So what then do we think constitutes jail time? The most clear thing is violence. When you commit violent crime, like an armed robbery, you are more likely to get prison time. When you stab someone, you get prison time. Within the definition of violence, it's too limited in its scope in the status quo. Financial crimes are violent and disgusting and violent and ought to be punished. So why then do we think that these individuals who commit this deserve, or why then do we think firstly that on principle, white-collar crimes are very morally egregious? First layer here is to say that it is intentional and greedy and calculated. Note that the kind of individuals that are characterized commit these crimes have a lot of tools at their disposal to be able to accumulate their wealth. They are choosing to go above and beyond these opportunities that already exist to commit crime. For example, you can set up offshore accounts in order to avoid tax or to plug your funds in tax havens. They have a greater capacity to accumulate their wealth. They're able to do things like make charitable donations to their own foundation. That way they can evade, they can avoid paying certain kinds of taxes. The richer you are in society, the more tools you have at your disposal to be able to accumulate your wealth. Therefore, going above and beyond what is legal and what is already permissible within the law is you taking an active and intentional stance that you want to break the trust of society and shatter the fabric of a social contract. We think the richer you are, you have more disposal to, for example, do things like lobby against progressive taxes by finding candidates who are more conservative. But they choose to do this and go above and beyond what is go above and beyond that. We think that this is particularly harmful because what they do here is actually violent towards individuals. The consequence of you not paying your fair share in taxes is the decreased ability for states to provide welfare. So you're directly taking food off of the table of poor families in the status quo. We think that is an act of violence in much in the same way as that you actively preventing someone from being able to access their basic human rights and basic needs. So what is important here is that this establishes malicious and deliberate intent on the part of these individuals. Note, in criminal sentencing, in the status quo, for someone to get prison time, there has to be proof of an intent and a deliberate, calculated intent of doing this. We think that this proves this because you have to do things like actively get accountants to hide your assets or actively circumvent the law in a manner that allows you to proliferate this profit or this personal wealth, and we think that's abusable. Closing.
Note that violence in and of itself isn't the only prerequisite for something to be a crime. Even assault charges themselves can be suspended. Why is this enough of an infringement?
Sure, assault can be suspended, but you probably get sentenced to prison, or that's a significant mitigating factor. The basis though is that if you commit assault, you're probably gonna face prison time if charges are pressed against you. So what we are saying here is that these same criteria or the same minimum should exist. We are fine with outsourcing to the justice system and legal experts to do things like consider whether or not there's mitigating circumstances, or to do things like have a sliding scale of punishment. So a middle class, middle management worker who commits financial fraud is less is going to get less time than the top executive who has more of the opportunities that I've just outlined to be able to legally accumulate wealth and not intentionally breaking the fabric of societal trust. But secondly, we think that the justice system currently is disproportionate with regards to how it punishes this. So what the previous government has proven is that when people commit these kinds of crimes in order to accumulate their own wealth is because of what might be natural human greed and a propensity to want to have as many material goods as possible. However, people do this within their capabilities. So the converse of this is that when we establish motive and opportunity for people who aren't as wealthy, it's oftentimes because they do this in ways that are violent in the status quo. So someone going to steal and rob a shop and then they get sentenced to prison. There is a disparity here. The wealthier individuals who have more legal opportunities and more a greater way of being able to accumulate wealth are getting off with fines that they can easily sweep under the carpet, whereas the poor are being disproportionately targeted for their poverty and the lack of means to accumulate wealth in a manner which is probably legal. What is the importance here? We think that insofar as we can allow rich individuals to be able to easily sweep things like fine under the rug and not have a criminal record which faces an indictment on them and their future prospects. This is something which is particularly harmful. But secondly, current efforts do not adequately adequately compensate for the harm that has been done because there's a time lag here. For example, if a bridge is not built because of tender fraud or welfare is not given, there's not just it's not just enough to rebuild that bridge later on because there's a time lag that also needs to be compensated for, given that you could not be productive if you did not have food on that day. So you are robbing individuals who are oftentimes minorities and the most destitute in society of the limited and precious time, and then the only way we compensate for time lost is through imprisonment. And because of these reasons, we think that one, this is particularly intentional and malicious, but secondly, it harms the most vulnerable in society. The justice system can only imprison. Propose.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Eric. I'd like to move on to the Leader of Opposition to open the opposition.
I'm going to be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the point at which side government wants us to accommodate for certain people in society, that being the people that are most affected by this type of crime, we tell you that we are better off to use the mechanism of remuneration, reparative mechanisms, as opposed to just putting people in jail. Why is this the case? Because we think that money money isn't necessarily limited to amount of time. We think that this money can always be redistributed and given back to the people that it needed the most. What does this mean? Well, when you look at cases like the Martin Shkreli case, not only was he fined and that fine was paid to the government, but further from this, it was given to the victim funds or the people that he directly impacted. Why is this important? This is important to note because what exists on our side is some sort of accommodation for the actor that is most affected. This is important to note because we don't necessarily have this inside government. Why? Because the reality is that the amount of effort it takes to put someone in prison, especially direct imprisonment, is far more than you would gain from, is far more than in the case of like just punishing them monetarily. And further from this, the fact that the benefits that are accrued on this side and our side are far more just proves why their case is weak, not taken, right? And so, at the point at which they come up and tell us further from this, that right, look, these people have to be in a position of privilege to even enact in these crimes, what do we tell you? Well, if their position in society is solely determined by the money they have, we should punish them by taking away that money. Quite simply, the fact of the matter is that if you want to remove that privilege, if you want to accommodate for the harm that is being done, take away what is most valuable to them, money. If greed is the root of all evil, let's take away what is the source of that greed. Right, so let's look onto the not taken at 5 minutes. Okay, so now let's look at like what is white collar crime, because it hasn't necessarily been engaged with to a deeper level of analysis. Because what we think is that the violence that exists in white collar crime is not proportional to the direct imprisonment that is proposed by side government, right? Because we don't necessarily think there's a necessity when the psychology behind fraud compared to murder is so few and far between, to the point at which like we could argue that the fraudsters, the people that have embezzled money, are far easier to reintegrate into society as opposed to the person that is actively intending to cause harm to a person's life, right? And this is going to link into a bigger point of an intergenerational principle, right? Because the reality is that what happens not taken at 5 minutes, and the reality is what we have to understand is at the point at which someone, let's say, murders a person, not only is their family affected, but the people surrounding their family is affected, the friends, the people that have been involved in their life. And this is important to note because the actors that are impacted on the one side of the debate, that being violent crime as opposed to fraud, is far and few between, right? We can see that more actors are affected from the murder that is committed. And this is important to note because through a way of what we can see is that if we can see that the harm caused in these crimes is different and that there is less harm caused to the overall support structure of those people, we believe we shouldn't be giving the same punishment as for murdering a person, taking away their life. Right? And this is important to understand because this links into the extent of harm, right? And the impact it has on the long term, right? Because what we'll say is that what we'll say is that, like, in the reality, we are not justifying this greed. We do not say that this crime is okay, but we do think that the punishment should be proportional, right? So when we look at, for instance, a person that is embezzling money, a lot of the time they're taking money away from pensioners, right? And we don't think that necessarily is okay, but it is not as nefarious as actively stalking, hunting down a person, and ensuring that they can no longer carry on with what they're doing, right? Carry on with life. And this is important to note because a different state of mind should be a mitigating factor to what punishment we give to these people. And this is why the nuanced analysis of who these people are, why they commit the crimes, is fundamentally important to how we punish them, right? If the way they are able to commit these crimes is through a position of privilege, let's take that privilege away. If their issue is that greed is really driving them and their intention is to get more money, let's remove that. Let's take that away because we're more likely to teach some sort of reformative and reparative lesson than we are to get from direct imprisonment, which quite simply says we are going to put this person in a room, lock the door, and forget where the key is, right? And we don't necessarily think that is as valuable as what we get from, for instance, reallocating the funds that have been stolen to the victims who were harmed, right? And so let's look into like the mitigating factors because we have to understand that the reality is a lot of the time when these embezzlement cases happen or when corruption occurs, like we have to understand the proximity these people have to the crime, right? We think that the CEO who embezzles the money is should be far more held accountable than the person that just co-signed the form or didn't necessarily know what was happening, right? I'll take a POI.
Their logic is weird. They say we punish murder with prison because it harms a family. Stealing money from the government or embezzling corporations of millions means that thousands of people lose jobs and we therefore have wider harm, you need to defend that.
But the thing is that the money doesn't disappear. The idea that we can't regain that money that is given, that is taken away, is just a fallacy. The reality is that I think as a victim, I would much rather get $1 million payout than just seeing this person die in prison, right? I don't necessarily think I accrue the same amount of benefits as I would, especially if this is an economic harm, and the people that you identify and being affected as the most vulnerable, the poorest of the poor, would they not gain more from getting some sort of monetary reparation as opposed to this direct imprisonment? Because it isn't necessarily something based on a moral consideration. At the end of the day, if you can't put food on your table, you're going to take the payout rather than seeing this person die in jail, not take it. Right? So then when we understand that the proximity to the crime is a mitigating factor in these instances, and that the willingness to commit these crimes should also contribute to how we consider that the extent of harm, we should realize that if anything, the point at which we put people directly in prison regardless of their proximity to crime is the moment at which we commit extended harms, right? And so this is the point at which, right, as a side opposition, we can see why, if we really want to put the punishment on these people in a sense that not only helps the actors that are affected by that crime, but also in the sense of creating some sort of societal lesson, we're far better on our side than we are on the side of direct imprisonment, right? Because the double harm that exists on their side is far worse than what exists on our side, right? Because we don't get any reparative justice, we don't get any form of rehabilitation. Instead, what we get is this idea that we should get retribution, we should get revenge on these people, and we don't necessarily think that is akin to some sort of benefit, right? And so when we look at this case, we have to understand that money can be moved around, but we can't bring back a person's life. And for these reasons, and for the principles that will be extended on by our second speaker, we will prove that not only does the intergenerational impact and benefits that lie on our side are far more than what exists on their side, but further from this, we think that the mitigating factors that exist and the actors who are accommodated for our side are far better off than what exists on their side. And for these reasons, I'm proud to oppose.
No man, thank you very much, leadership of Neo. We'll have the Deputy Prime Minister to further the government case now. Here, here.
Alright, can you all hear me? Cool. Panel, don't let opening opposition lie to you. The very fact that last week we had a case in the court regarding the woman who had 4 million deposited into her account from Nesmas. Not only was she forced back to pay the money, but she was sent to jail too. Their main exclusive benefit of we should get the money back doesn't exist only on their side. We think that's just a basic line that fails to ignore the fact there are compensation orders. We think even in criminal murder cases, you are sent to jail as well as an order for compensation based on the damages you caused the victim. Complete lies, throw them out. Two things that we're going to be proving in this debate. Firstly, we think that for them to allege that because it wasn't a direct physical harm, it doesn't carry the same connotations and is therefore not worthy of imprisonment is quite frankly ridiculous. I'll be showing you in my speech why even if it didn't warrant like the same things, we think that because of the proportionate and because of who was committing these crimes, imprisonment is the only way to go forward. But secondly, we just think that all their benefits need to be proved while they mutually exist on their side. They need to prove how they make the world better. We tell you that they don't. Two main issues that we've had from like opening opposition's case, let me show you why they're already under debate. Firstly, they told us that they would rather have like monetary measures, and that we think is just completely a lie. We think compensation orders exist. We don't think that's exclusive on your side of the house. But secondly, and this is the entirety of Eric's speech, is that we don't think these like measures of money in and of themselves right now are proportionate. A few reasons for this, and then in addition, I will give you my entire speech. I'll flag it when I get there. Firstly, we told you about the idea of time. We think at the point where you just have to give the money back, it doesn't acknowledge the fact that there was additional harms that had taken place. It was people's times, it was the physical discomfort and the situations that they had to suffer. It was the indignity of the situation of being a victim of financial crime, which is often a very egregious process in and of itself. We think that's an extremely detrimental thing. They need to acknowledge that. But secondly, we just don't think that them to argue that it's like, oh, it's not proportionate to murder because there wasn't the same psychological malevolence. Panel, the point at which you're willing to manipulate, plan, and exploit the people who trusted you with your finances is the point at which you are equally psychopathic. Just because I'm not physically like hurting someone doesn't mean I haven't displayed the same malicious intent. More so, in fact, if anything, because people who have actively trusted you and in a professional capacity as well as a personal, we think breaking that is a serious void of the contract. very problematic there. But secondly, just for them to say, oh, it's like disproportionate, obviously we're not going to throw you in prison for like 50 years, seconds of murder if all you did was like embezzle $5 million. We think proportionality and it's going to exist on a sliding scale. That's a very important thing. You can't just allege. We think that the justice system exists in that sense. But also, like, just lastly, because they say it's like not convenient, we don't ever think we opt simply for the convenient alternative when it comes to justice. We opt for the alternative that brings the best amount of retribution, rehabilitation, and deterrence. We think those are the three core principles of the justice system we learn in grade 8 debating. Then moving on to my speech now, I will show you why we fulfill all the votes. So just generally, we think they are escalated to the point, firstly, where their benefits aren't mutually exclusive, but secondly, they're alleging that there is no psychological harm. We think there very much is. What am I going to be doing in my speech now? Three things. I'll be discussing under the basic analysis of retribution, rehabilitation, and deterrence, why this is the only type of punishment that we can consider acceptable for these criminals. Firstly, in terms of retribution, we think at the point where you're a white-collar criminal, as Eric has already displayed to you, you are in a position of immense power and privilege. Why is this important? It means that comparatively, you having to be forced to pay a fine doesn't affect you in the same way that it would affect everyone else. We think at the point where the 10,000 rand is the difference between someone else's dinner, but for you it's just like pocket money. We think that there isn't the idea that you're actually having to pay for your crimes. We think it doesn't affect you tangibly. There is no sense of like retribution in the general power balance of what was taken in the world. Secondly, we think that just in terms of retribution, for you to be removed from society, that's very important for the victim at the point where you've hurt a significant amount of their freedom, especially important because financial freedom is one of the basic ways in which you can live a life. It values as much as like physical freedom. We think that is very important. But we also think it's like judicially important because this is the one point where there is equality within the justice system. We think, just because I'll take you at 5, we think just the point where you're removed from society, you are unable to exist as a free actor, you don't have all the benefits that you normally would, is the point where you're equal. We don't think that money is equality. We think being removed from your lifestyle, having to endure the discomfort of prison, is the point at which there is equal punishment regardless of that. We think that that is important, that for your punishment for your crime, we would like to achieve some standard of equality in the way that it impacts you personally. Secondly, let's just talk about like rehabilitation, why we think that's important. Before that, go.
Davies, the vast majority of white-collar crimes don't even impact the poor directly anyway. If you look at inside trading, that's just on investors.
So firstly, we think that there is a significant amount of impact. We're talking about like bad tenures for government, which are directly taken away from this. Let's look at the mental health crisis in Chitty 5 years ago. We think that that was a significant harm. But even at the point where they don't impact, we think because we would punish motivation of greed and willingness to commit harms against another human, enough reasonable punishment right there. Secondly, let's talk about rehabilitation. We think, firstly, it's quite important at the point where you're forced to acknowledge your crime. We think prison is one of the most tangible ways that we can make you do that. Unlike just paying a fine which you can then sweep under the rug, or just ignoring your balance statement for the next 10 years, having to tangibly go to prison, see people who your crimes have harmed, is a very powerful physical experience that we value. We want to make people confront the realities of the crime. We think the seriousness the prison carries is an important thing there. And this leads into my third point of deterrence. 2 levels under this. Firstly, that we simply don't think fines are enough right now. We think, given the immensely powerful nature of white-collar criminals, they're very easily able to be like, just, one less car that I can afford. We think at the point where it infringes on your personal freedom and your ability to enact as a free actor, that's especially important. Especially considering white-collar crime were committed out of greed and out of the want to better your social circumstances and to live a better life, being taken away from the joys of not being able to drive the Maserati around, significantly harmful. Being able, in prison, just generally a fairly shitty place. We don't think you have like the nice comforts. We think you're exposed to intense physical discomfort. We think the lack of like limitation is quite a humbling experience that we want to expose individuals to. But secondly, we think it's important to break the harms of like the stereotype of a criminal. The perception that crimes are only serious at the point at which an individual goes to prison does 2 things. Firstly, it illegitimizes the idea that financial crimes are like any less serious. We think this is problematic. Firstly, because it allows the financial criminals to go, oh, I'm not one of a criminal. It was just, minor money whoopsies. We think that's a very problematic attitude to have that enables white-collar crimes. We need to take a more serious stance to prevent that from happening. But secondly, I've shown you why we think it's so morally reprehensible that you have intent, calculating, planning for like an attack for money that you've taken from people you trust. We think that's very problematic. In order to win this debate, opposition needs to prove firstly how deterrence is better achieved on their side, never be more proud to oppose.
you very much, Deputy Prime Minister Daisy. We'd like to move on to the Deputy Leader of Opposition to further the opposition case here.
I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Panel, I thought the days were long gone when we got TUT speeches about man on the ground and how that rhetoric justifies an action, right? We think that's basic, and then we think that's primarily what you get from a government, right? It's a lot of rhetoric telling us why they should go to jail, not how this action in and of itself is just as a form of reparation to their action. We think that's fundamentally why they're out of the debate, because we can say that too. Congrats, Eric, right? Cool. A couple of things that we're going to engage with here, right? Let's take them at their ideological next. The benefit of their case, right, is to say that at the point at which you stop these people from being free actors and then they don't have the same benefits they would have in society by taking them to jail, that's when you hold them accountable. We tell you this can be achieved by the forms of that aren't direct punishment. You can do this by financially destabilizing these individuals. It's important then that Mel gives you the example of Martin Squarely. We think we can achieve that on our side of the house, again, not mutually exclusive, right? They tell us again this point of the time lag. We tell you if the time lag is the problem here, then taking these people to jail doesn't fix the time lag, right? We tell you that financial compensation is far better, not yet, right? Far better at fixing and addressing that issue in and of itself, right? So even if you identify that as an issue, you don't address it on your side of the house. I think that's quite, that's fundamentally important, right? What else do they tell us, yeah? They tell us at the same point, they tell us because of this time lag, then it is justified to send someone to jail. There is no link in this argumentation. We don't necessarily buy it, right? What do you get from Noah's speech and why is it important, right? Noah tells you 2 points, right? I'm going to give you 2 points of extension exclusively. He tells you that the extent of the harm is such that we need to have like economic punishment. We tell you here, the principle of justification here is to say, intergenerationally, it is far more beneficial to the children of the people who lost their jobs to have that financial payout than it is for that person to be in jail. There is no cause and link because there's problem-solution mismatch. At that point, right, this action is morally just in and of itself because it acts in the interest not only of the victims, but the progeny of those victims. We cover more actors then under our side as opposed to then temporarily putting them in jail for some arbitrary benefit. Right? We tell you here exclusively, right? Engage with the principle of Martin Squarely, right? Someone who had to pay fines exclusively, but also had to pay compensations to the victims. At the point at which that happens, why is that something that you would regret, as opposed to sending these people to jail, right? Cool. 2 points of extension I'm going to give you this speech, right? Cool. The first point is this point of violence. The second one is the point of justice, right? We tell you here that in order for us to, in essence, get justice, the action in and of itself has to be reparative, right? We tell you the logic here is quite simple, right? If you send a thief to jail for less amount of time than you send a murderer, we understand that there are varying degrees of violence. At that point, if there are varying degrees of violence, there are varying solutions as to how we address that violence. At that point, we tell you then that we address it better under our side of the house. Because the economic harm here is different than the mortality harm. This is to say that if I kill someone, you cannot bring that person back from the dead. However, if I steal your money and I am a rich man, this means to say that I can give you back that money and then some, right? You think this is fundamentally more beneficial than taking them to jail, right? Before that, Eric, try it.
So, we take them to jail, they pay back the money. What is the harm? We get more justice for all of the people and you compensate for such harm.
You have to take into consideration that even if these people committed a crime, there are moral actors, so you have to justify double the punishment under your side of the house. You don't do that. By simply saying someone is rich, therefore they deserve the crime, is not a justification as to why they should have double the punishment. We tell you if we adequately address the harm under our side of the house, then we tell you that there is no need for the additional harm to exist in and of itself, right? Centrally to your case, you have to justify why that double punishment was particularly important. You don't do that, right? Because that's important. So, If we understand that the judicial system has like various degrees of assault, we understand that there's various approaches, right? This nuance is important here, panel, because this nuance requires us to understand how we best achieve justice, right? Because if this debate will go on to justice and who best achieves justice, we tell you through the outside the house, right? Now, when you talk about justice, there's another dependency, there's another principle of dependency we give here. This is to say that the actor that is dependent on us, there's an actor dependent on us to act in such a way that we address their moral agency as individuals. This is to say, without the action, they're left in a morally compromised position, right? We tell you here, at the point in which you don't allow accountability to exist, you allow the actor to exist in a situation in which their moral agency is not upheld. We uphold this best under the outside of the house by some sort of economic sanction that allows us to engage with it, right? Triton.
Deal with the fact that white-collar criminals don't care about money, it doesn't affect them in the same way. Why do you not want equality and justice?
Okay, logically, if your harm is that the fines are too small, the fines can get bigger. Cool. Then you can find like you can just take more money from them. That's not the harm. That is also not a justification as to why we warrant jail time, because then you don't address the harm in and of itself, right? I think that's important. Comparatively, when they tell you this thing of how they want to break the stereotypes, because apparently, according to the logic, people who commit white-collar crimes are criminals, but logically, if you're found guilty of a crime, it's to say that you know that you did the wrong publicly, and we punish you for that crime. You don't change the stereotype out of your house, you just further enable that device and of itself, we think that's important, right? So, what do we give you exclusively in opposition? We give you a case that caters not only to the most vulnerable actor in the debate, but their progeny here, right? So we tell you the number of people that we address is wider. The extent of our benefit is far greater reaching than their benefit, right? We tell you that it's far more likely to be achievable because it already exists in society. At that point, we're not changing anything, right? We think that's particularly important, right? We don't get any sort of like justification as why direct imprisonment in and of itself is good, besides the fact that these people are rich. We don't think that helps the case. We tell you it's be more comparatively better on the bench. These are the more examples to propose.
Thank you very much, dear Lord Tumelo. We are going now to the member of government to further the government case. Here.
Hi everyone, I'm Abby for Xuhe, and I'm just grabbing my glasses. I'm going to be starting in 3, 2, 1. I bet you didn't expect for a prison abolitionist argument to come from the government side in today's debate, but that's exactly what you're getting. It's time to reframe what prison looks like and show you why these individuals are one of the only individuals in society who actually deserve to go to prison. Most of my response is going to be integrated into my matter and is going to be catered for within my substantive points. But just quickly, on the idea that came up of the fines will just get bigger, miscontextualization of what these people's lives look like. They exist in wealthy spaces, their mummies and daddies are rich, they have trust funds set up for them, right? They went to schools to be able to get degrees. These are people that are going to be able to make wealth back. So taking a lot of money away from them, even if you literally take every cent in their bank account, not good enough. Cool. Our substantive is going to give you the extension on the idea of reframing prison. What this is going to do is give you 2 benefits. It's going to tell you, number 1, why sending these people to prison removes the most evil individuals from society and how we think that is the aim of a prison system. And then number 2, how this reshapes the way that we look at criminality and how this ultimately benefits individuals who are oppressed by the current justice system, namely marginalized groups, namely poor people. Right, so additionally, our case is going to be catering for whether or not these individuals' crimes actually cause like tangible harms towards poor individuals, because this is apparently something that's contested. We think that our opening did a sufficient job in proving why this does cause mass harm. We think that when a company collapses because of embezzlement and those jobs are lost, that's harm that's going to last regardless of the financial compensation that's given. But moreover, we'll give the financial compensation too, like, right? That's not something that exists only on your side. So even though they've already shown why, it's highly, highly likely, and in almost every single case, white-collar crimes cause direct harm to the most vulnerable individuals through things like loss of jobs, through things like loss of tenders, will still cater for if it doesn't on a principal level. Let me jump straight in, right? Why are white-collar criminals the actual worst, right? So here we get the idea of the prison abolition argument, and this is the idea of accounting for circumstance. What circumstance looks like is things like being born into certain marginalized groups. It looks like being born into poorer communities. Circumstance caters for a lot of things, and this is why a lot of people don't believe prisons should be something that exists. Instead, they prefer things like social change to prevent these crimes from happening in the first place. What crimes can be prevented through social change? Things like stealing can very logically be prevented through things like provision of adequate welfare. Things like violent crimes, every statistic has shown that violent crimes occur more prevalently within poor and uneducated communities. Things like gender-based violence, we see that when you decrease gender inequality, things like gender inequity and things like perceptions of women within society, as a consequence of that, gender-based violence decreases too. What cannot be decreased through things like social change? Human greed and fundamental evil. These are the things that we should be imprisoning, because these are the things that no circumstance can account for, no amount of oppressive government can account for. These are the things that we need to be catering for. What are these things? White-collar criminals. Right. Why are criminals actually the worst? 3 reasons. Number 1, they display no concern for the most vulnerable individuals in our society. We have shown why white-collar crimes directly impact the most poor people in our society. And if you didn't believe Daisy and Eric, then believe us when we tell you that money is always cyclical. Any kind of fucking with the monetary system fucks with the people who are most affected by that monetary system. Money laundering directly affects poor people, whether they lose their jobs, whether they get financial compensation in ways that are not tangible, because economics works on a cyclical idea of money that is fucked with in the beginning, fucked with in the end, right? So even the people who you can't see being affected by this are, right? So they display no concern for the people who are the most vulnerable, namely the people who will be affected by the messing with money. Secondly, they lack integrity to the extent that they're willing to lose all of their money, they're willing to go to prison, they're willing to lose their business and allow people to lose jobs, like they lack that integrity to such an extent for the fundamental principle of their own greed, of their own growing, of their own capital, right? We see that no concern for vulnerable people, coupled with a huge lack of basic human integrity, how does it get more evil? Here we tell you what is evil. Evil is complacence or active participation in the harming of other people. Where else are you getting complacence and participation in the active harming of individuals? In our cases, white-collar crimes. We see that evil is secondly disruption of mass systems on which people rely for their livelihoods. What is disrupting mass systems on which people rely for their livelihoods? Screwing with money, screwing with the economy, that's going to just be disadvantaging poor individuals. Before I tell you what this means for our case, sure.
Please explain the link on how retribution maybe prevents greed if it's innate.
Alright, why there aren't alternatives? We've given you fines. You can't fine a rich person in a way that's going to benefit them. There is already a saying that says if something is punished by a fine, all you're saying is it's legal for the rich. Redistribution of funds. We support this too. Nothing on your side shows exclusivity. We want redistribution of funds. We want everyone in this situation to be compensated as fully as possible. Thirdly, taking away all of their money. Right, this happens in prison. Like, do you think they have wallets in their pockets in their prison cell? They don't. So all of the alternatives that you give us on your side either happen on our side too, or aren't viable alternatives. I've shown you why you can do things like retributive justice when it comes
comes to violent crimes. You can do things like retributive justice when it comes to gender-based violence, when it comes to stealing, when it comes to violent robberies. You can do retributive justice when it comes to these ideas. You can do therapy, you can do psychology, you can do education. What you can't educate for, what you can't do psychology for, is fundamental human evil and human greed. And I've shown you why these criminals fit this description. What extensions have we given you within our case today? We've told you that we agree with Daisy and Eric that these criminals are fundamentally horrible individuals that are not prosecuted enough within our debate. We have told you that we agree with Daisy and Eric that these individuals cause direct harm to poor people, as well as indirect harm to poor people through the way that economics works. But additionally, we've reframed prison and shown you why, under every single abolitionist argument, these people are the only individuals who truly deserve to be going to prison. Why do we think it's justified to make them bear the brunt of 2 punishments, as we get in your case? They display a complete disregard for society. We do not think they should be allowed to participate in this society any longer. If you are, I'm still talking like 30 minutes. Okay, that's all that time.
Thank you very much, Member of Government Abby. Apologize for your time running out. Would have wanted to read more. We're going now to the Member of Opposition to further the opposition case. Here.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm Adam here, key controls. Alright, are we ready to begin? Okay. 3, 2, 1. So far, we haven't gotten a nuanced idea of what white-collar crime actually looks like, because we've taken this premise that it's one evil person in a room deciding to steal money and that they should be in prison. But it's much, much deeper. Generally, these are entire groups of people, entire industry standards with direct incentives. We're going to be adding this unique context, and this is going to change everything. So, one additional thing that we're doing in our extension that our opening didn't do. The core amount of their analysis is they said that imprisonment just always isn't the correct case and that there's something unique about these financial things. An issue that they're now facing is there's a mutual exclusivity issue there, right? Because they can also take money. So what we're doing and how we're changing this debate is we're telling you that if you try to imprison these people, you're going to be imprisoning less of them, and you're not going to be imprisoning the people that you want to be imprisoning. 3 major bits of rebuttal. Firstly, let's deal with opening. The major idea we get from them is that this is a proportional response, but they don't really argue proportionality, they just argue that punishment is important. 5 major levels here. Firstly, the fact that you link this to violence isn't even perfect in itself. We look at Will Smith slapping Chris Rock, that was violence that didn't cause for some type of imprisonment, and so you need, if you were just going to fight violence, you needed to prove violence was worth that in all cases, and you didn't. Secondly, we tell you that it's not always proven that white-collar crime harms those who are most vulnerable. We talk about insider trading. What does that look like? Knowing that you can do something to make a stock rise, investing in the stock, and then gaining more money as that stock rise. There's been no link and there's no analysis as to how that actually harms poor people. You just take away the capacity for rich people to get more money. Thirdly, we tell you that this idea of a time lag is that there's always a capacity to give more money for that time lag and to distribute for it. In a sense that might not be mutually exclusive, we'll tell you how with imprisonment, you're not going to be getting any money to face that time lag. But fifthly, we tell you that there's this idea of it not being proportional, because these people don't care about money. Did they not just commit a crime to get more money? We tell you that of course they care about money. They wouldn't have committed the crime otherwise. So we tell you that we are actually taking these people, taking from them what they want. The second major idea we get from our opening is this idea of disincentives, that they'll know they'll be punished and they'll stop. They didn't commit these crimes in order to fail. They knew there were punishments both sides and they still went and committed them anyway. Given that these people were arrogant to think they weren't going to fail, of course they were going to do it again. Also, these are the most powerful people on planet Earth. They definitely think they're above the law. Changing those laws won't change that fundamental underlying fact. Now let's deal with our closing. One major idea here. They give us this idea that there's a fundamental evil and that these people are fundamentally bad. But just in the way that changes circumstances changes things like theft and assault, we tell you that some countries are definitely more corrupt than others. There are reasons why South Africa has significantly more corruption than a place like Sweden, and we tell you that there are perverse incentives and rules that dictate these things. Many corrupt people in South Africa steal because they work from poverty. We're not justifying that necessarily. But do note that perverse incentives do cause these crimes, just like any other crime that we do punish for, we mustn't allow them to give us the synopsis that it's exclusive. Okay, so what major argumentation are we running here? We're going to be telling you that if you want to make the major line imprisonment, you're not going to be imprisoning the people who make these decisions. What is our major contextualization here? There are two different types of people engaged in white-collar crime. Firstly, the people who make the decision to launder the money, and then the people who they tell to go and do the job. It's not like Jacob Zuma actually stole the money himself. He had accountants, he had lawyers, and those people are also people who you're saying should be imprisoned. I'll be telling you why that is a problem. 4 levels. Firstly, given that we have this idea of middle management, we do have this idea of fraudulence. If you were an accountant at KPMG, when the government asked you to audit their accounts, you did a crime. You weren't allowed to do that, and what you should have done is supposedly you should have stepped down and forgiven your job. We think that that's an incredibly high ask for someone to say that as a middle manager accountant at KPMG, just looking at accounts and realizing that something might be wrong, but deciding to go through it because you're putting your kid through private school, yes, is probably not ideal, but definitely not enough to get you thrown in prison. Secondly, we tell you sometimes it isn't just an individual KPMG case. Let's look at the Lehman Brothers before 2008, right? By the time you had a general industry consensus in the United States of selling subprime mortgage loans, something that was absolutely not okay and was absolutely going to crash the financial system, and this is something that was known, as a banker, you couldn't have made the same profits and existed in that competitive industry unless you opted in. So, we tell you that given that, you need to be able to account for the fact that firstly, you have many people operating under perverse incentives that they cannot escape. These people are not as powerful as you think they are. They're not always decision makers, but they're people working regular jobs, and you're expecting them to forgo that those entire savings, that entire stability, just to avoid prison. We just don't think that's fair. But furthermore, we tell you that you're dealing with thousands of people. Thousands and thousands and thousands. How they all go to prison, we have no clue. But I'll be telling you who then goes to prison if there's a scarcity. Close it.
Alright, you're lying to us if you're telling that the justice system doesn't cater for people who are told to do things through their jobs. They do, and they get a lot less of a prison sentence, if any.
But your less prison sentence is still sending someone to prison. Your case is still sending thousands, millions of American bankers, every single person in the industry, into a jail cell. That's not going to work, that's not feasible, but also let's talk about why you won't be sending thousands. Thirdly, you allow the government to get away with it. With things like the Lehman Brothers, there should have been legislation to hold banks accountable. This should have been foreseen because it was foreseen and the government turned its head away, right? If you're going to tell me the entire government should go to prison, good luck showing me that your case is going to work. So actually what you do by putting these people in prison is you ignore the fact that the government set up those perverse incentives in the first place. But most importantly, you completely ignore the decision makers, because when the financial crash happened and the bankers knew they were going to prison, the decision makers, quite wrongfully, looked at their middle managers and said it was their fault. Not a single decision maker went to prison for the 2008 crisis. It was all middle managers because the prison system couldn't deal with the thousands of people who were at fault, and so the really rich and powerful people who had the influence put it on the middle managers, and the innocent guy went to jail. What do we tell you is closing that wasn't done? We are talking about the most powerful people who will very gladly pay a fine, and that has an impact. What we do tell you, though, is that these people are not going to be sent to jail, and so what they'll do is they'll reverse accountability, and the innocent people, they won't go to prison, and more innocent middle managers who are operating under perverse incentives given by the government go to jail. We don't think that's fair. We side with closing opposition.
Thank you very much to the member of opposition. Call upon the government whip to close up the government case. Here, here.
Alright, just me two seconds. Hi, my name is Ammaarah. She's not going on. Okay, cool. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel,
when we decide what we do as people who care about justice, we ought to always care about firstly the man on the ground, but two, when we make arguments and debate, we don't just say that we're not going to send people to prison because they won't go to prison. We understand that justice, we understand the prison system, because it's further more than just practicalities. We care about principles. As the side of the house that firstly cares about the impact, but also cares about the idea of principles, we think we already win. Not just going to assert to you why we think that we're significantly better than this side, but further than our opening gov. I'm going to prove it to you. A few important questions that we beg to ask you as a panel in order for us to understand who's winning this debate. First and foremost, do we think that white-collar crimes are innately things that are harmful, and why? Secondly then, how do we best do justice? Third question we ought to ask ourselves, is jail something that becomes justified? And lastly then, do we think we actively get, or do we actively think we're punishing the right types of people? These are the four questions that you're going to ask yourself in this debate, but moreover, these are the four questions that we're going to answer and we're going to win. First and foremost, under this idea of do we think that these people, or like white-collar crimes, are innately harmful crimes within today's debate? We get a weird line from side opposition where they tell us that it's probably just not going to be that deep. We don't effectively harm the massive amounts of people that we claim to under side, like proposition or side government. Firstly, as somebody who doesn't understand a lot about economics, I don't think it's neuroscience. Quite frankly, at the point at which you're going to cripple a business or you're going to take away lots of money from a business and that business is likely to shut down or close, we think that people are losing jobs. At the point at which you as a rich man in society are not going to pay your taxes, but all of your buddies that you go golfing with are not going to pay their taxes as well, there is no money that is going to go into the government that is going to allow for things like social welfare, like housing, like paving the roads. We think that the money that doesn't come into the government then cannot go out of the government. We think that you are effectively going to affect people. If at the point in which people are losing jobs, if at the point in which people aren't receiving money, we think that you are having a direct impact. Money does make the world go around, and so at the point at which you're messing with money, you're messing with the world. You're going to mess with people. We don't think it's something that is like, we think it's quite intuitive. You have big brains, use them. Secondly then, how do we best do justice? Essentially then, they give us this idea that justice always needs to be proportional, but moreover, we don't always have to send people to prison. They give us the analogy that you're able to give something back, and therefore it should be enough. We think that this is strange. When somebody robs a house or steals a car, we don't just say to the person who did the robbery, you need to give that back. Why? Because we understand that it is far deeper than just like something that has been taken. Further than the monetary or the material thing that has been taken, one, you're giving somebody a traumatic experience. Two, you're giving somebody a lack of dignity. Thirdly then, we understand that we need to have an element of deterrence that person does not commit the crime again. So it's not just about the idea that something needs to be given back or something needs to be compensated. There needs to be a level of punishment. We care about punishing people. That's something that's just a fact. Further then, we don't just punish people in a way that is convenient. We punish people in a way that we think is proportional and that has a larger impact than just taking away money. So why then do we think that compensation is not something that is fair in this case? Ali and Daisy and Eric from their first already tell you that money is just not that deep for these people. Even if it's a large sum of money, it's likely that the biggest impact you're going to have from them is going from super rich to quote-unquote comfortable. We don't think it's something that's going to harm them. Further then, why we think that we're able to do justice better under the idea of like prison is because of the fact that like sending people away or taking them away from like the active society is a punishment. And so we don't think that compensation is ever going to be enough. We don't think that taking money away from people who have an excess amount of money is going to be something that effectively harms them. Further then, we just don't think that compensation is mutually exclusive. We think you needed to do more on both of your sides. Thirdly then, do we think that jail is something that becomes justified? Essentially under their idea, we get the idea that jail is something that is disproportionate. We get the idea that it's something that is not needed. We've never needed to assert to you or prove to you why people who commit embezzlement or fraud were proportionate to people who committed murder. We think that even within jail currently, we have different sentences for different things. I think that was a weird comparison to be making. But secondly then, why we think that jail becomes exceptionally justified under the idea of fraud or embezzlement, or specifically under white-collar crimes, I'll tell you when I'm done with this point, we think it becomes justified because the intent that comes with somebody who's committing these white-collar crimes is 1, evil, 2, malicious, and 3, causes an exceptional amount of harm. If we like to characterize the justice system as one that is ineffective in terms of helping people in like social disenfranchisement and people who exist as like victims of their circumstance, then we think that we're fair in characterizing the justice system as being able to help at this point. And so we think that the people who are most justified in being sent to prison are the ones who are greedy, are the ones who are evil, are the ones who are just as shitty as the place that we're going to send them to. So here we think that at the point at which you're able to send people who commit white-collar crimes to prison, you allow for prison to be something that is effectively used, but also we think that you have the most justified type of people being sent to prison. Adam, go.
Pragmatically, how do you send thousands of individuals, mostly middle managers who are following orders, to prison? There isn't enough space.
Alright, here's my last flash. Please don't let Adam's assertions of anger be something that convinces you in today's debate. First and foremost, why do we then think we're able to effectively have people being sent to prison? A few reasons here. First and foremost, we don't just throw out processes at the point at which we say that we're sending people directly to prison. We think that we have things like checks and balances. We think that we have things like interviews and queries and the ability to question the person who we want to send to prison at the point at which we send them to prison. So if we think that somebody is a middleman, we're going to ask them, who is the person who did X, Y, and Z? Who is the person at the top? The reason why Adam is able to give you examples of middlemen is because we know that they exist. We think that like processes exist in the justice system, and like if we want to send people at the top to prison, we're going to do that by implementing these processes. We just need to refine them. Secondly then, why we think that it's even justified to send the middleman to prison is because at the point in which we have them going to prison, we allow for that person to be persecuted. We think that like effectively they did something wrong, they did a crime, they're justified in doing that, they still had an impact on people. Further then, even if at the point in which we don't have people being sent to prison, we're principally justified in doing this because we don't just make legislation for the effect, we also make legislation based on principle. And so here we think we care about the principle of being able to say, you are so filthy and like unjustified in the action that you're doing that we will directly send you to prison. We think we need people to be scared of committing these crimes. We think we need people to care about the effects that they're going to have. Lastly then, at the end of my speech, we are winning as closing opposition, closing government, because we have the extension on why prison is something that is justified in the cases of these people and because we have justice.
Thank you very much, Government Whip Ammaarah. We're going to move now to the opposition whip to wrap up the debate here.
Sorry, just making sure, like, but sometimes I don't talk into the mic because I get deep.
Note that the reason we value the justice system in and of itself isn't only imposition of its moral standard, but it in itself to show an ability to justify and enact said moral standard. This is to say that you can't just assert that something should be done in society. You need to prove that actual consequences exist, but we think that Prop trying to run away from saying how does this pragmatically affect sentencing rates doesn't actually engage with what the justice system should be doing. Let's also then understand something and how we've cleaned up this debate, which we think has gone unanswered. One, note that both our sides of government have focused the vast majority of their analysis on these evil, big people in the sky, and haven't actually looked at people who are just trying to get by, doing their job, and actually trying not to alienate themselves from communities, particularly when they know that the people that they're reporting are more powerful than them and are likely to harm them in specific ways. We think that they try and run away from this and say that they're giving proportional punishment, but they still need to acknowledge that one, these people have done something wrong, meaning that they do need to face some form of recompense, but two, actually understanding and justifying that that proportion falls within such a grievous violation of such a grievous limitation of rights that is imprisonment. They don't do that. And then also, so then in saying that, how are we then going to show you how we won this debate? Two ways. Firstly, about why even we are best for proportionality. But two, because they do give some deterrence arguments and pragmatics, why we're even still better than in terms of protecting society from possible misharms from white-collar crime. So let's talk about proportionality. First point, let's understand here is about responsibility. Note, most of Eric's analysis is this. It says that one, violence in this is an act of violence, and therefore this act of violence can be punished. Note that that isn't in itself a realistic justification about why this is a limitation of rights to that extent. Why is that not true? Because we think, one, as Adam's slap example has proven, that we don't always say that violence automatically guarantees prison. But two, note that this in itself is probably a law, that base levels of violence, like a basic assault, often have imprisonment being larger reaching consequences than the actual act that can be committed. So this is to say, even if I committed some form of violence like punching someone, me being in prison, being around violent individuals, being ostracized from a society is a lifelong consequence than someone whose punch is going to probably get over it in less time than is imposed on you. Don't think that that in itself means that proportionality is likely to happen. No. Secondly, it's also not why money and monetary compensation that we give you in itself is in itself sufficient. Because one, we think that the crime which is the most quantifiable is financial crime, right? So we mean in terms of actually analyzing the harm that you've done unto individuals, saying that you've taken XYZ money that's caused XYZ harms. In addition to that, you've harmed that you also then deserve basic financial punishment for contravening governmental society. That is something we think can somewhat be quantified. Unlike any other harm, we think that we sufficiently do that without resorting to the drastic measures they do. Third thing, also note that they don't engage with the government in itself as an actor complicit. This is also under responsibility here when we tell you that specific things such as when they tell us that no, tell us things such as social welfare is something which is limited. Let's look at the countries that they talk about. Because countries with broken welfare systems are likely also places like SA, places like Brazil and Cuba, places which also suffer from corrupt governance. At the point of which you are allowing them to punish these groups, one, you also allow them to indicate blame because of just the amount of attention things get once prison is also introduced. But two, you also take away money or attention away from things such as financial compensation and the continued use of these funds that the government get away with, because that's the point people are seeing prison in itself as the only way in which it's done. But also then note that at that point, their harm and them saying that disproved and indirect violent harm is now disproven, right? Because at the point in which another foreign actor is contributing to this harm, the extent of which this harm is actually relevant and the extent of which you harm those individuals directly, and whether or not government has an ability to mitigate that harm and actually give food parcels in absence of that type isn't actually proven. They don't do that. Thirdly, no sit. Now let's also then talk about why in itself they then tell us this is not a punishment, therefore it's not proportional because rich people don't care about money. Adam deals with this in a one-liner when he says that people literally, if you care about money, you commit these crimes. But two, let's also then extend this idea when we tell you that these individuals themselves are people who still care about things like status. Status is also important and with these big evil men, and at the point of which you're losing enough money that they can see at worst can take you down a level on the financial ladder, that is something which has drastically changed the way in which you live your life. That is a punishment that is long lasting. Before I go on into this human greed point that was brought by closing, yes?
Lwandle, if I steal your house tuition funds and I put what is going to pay back after 2 years, is that justice or should I still be punished for being morally corrupt and wasting 2 years of your life?
Okay, then give me more money then to also make up for the time that I've lost. Like, I'm fine with you doing that. So then let's also then talk about human greed. Because then they tell us here, and this is closing's only extension. Note at the point that this is done, they have no water in this debate. They tell us that human greed is the most evil thing, and it's the most evil part. Adam deals with this when he tells you that human greed in itself is not necessarily always the prevailing factor. Oftentimes it's things of fear and self-preservation, because you fear for your job, and you feel like the people you're going to be reporting are simply more powerful than you. Second response here. In itself, how capitalist systems go and how governments actively enforce the existence of those systems, all the social harm they say that they need to be remedied. It is much of a harm that greed exists in society as people's propensity to commit violence and theft. When you are told that your value as an individual is innately linked to your wealth and your social standing, that is enough of a harm done by government that we think is necessary. Okay, then, let's also then move on then in terms of showing that we're principally justified in terms of one, proportionality and whether or not this is a fit punishment. Two, actually looking at the fact that human being has no water. And three, that we actually punish these people let's also then go into the effect of this. Because the main harm here is that deterrence. People are going to go and they're not going to be deterred. Okay, panel, generic argument, generic response. People don't do crimes to fail. You don't literally think. You don't do a crime with the intention of going to jail. Most of the time, these individuals have a perception of being above the law. Let's even extend this. The reason that these people are going to be likely to actually suffer from consequences is normally from fatigue from these processes. This means that government consistently pursuing you and becoming a battle of attrition that these people then weigh up the cost and financial costs and simply say they're willing to take some form of harm here because it's worse than actually just being in court and having your name broadcasted everywhere. At the point at which jail is now the outcome, that's always going to be worse than simply continuing the trial for them. And at that point, we think that no punishment happens to those individuals because they now want to prolong it longer to just not go to jail and have to have their life consistently and drastically altered. We also talked about this adversely and disproportionately affecting middle management, which means that there's an existence in society where people who are the conveyors of something instead of the actual progenitors are disproportionately punished. That goes unresponded to for the majority part. Look at the side that actually engages with full scope with this debate. Look at the side that gives you true justice. CO takes this convincingly.
Okay, thank you very much. If you could make your way out as quickly as possible, that would be great.